All right, so I am going to kind of set the stage for hopefully some of our other speakers today, and really try to talk about some of the challenges with moving to confinement, but also some of the opportunities. So I hope that this is a pretty unbiased and a good representation of what we might be considering when we start thinking about moving cattle into confinement. So, all right, let's try that again. All right, so when we start thinking about confinement barns and we are trying to kind of set the stage here, keep in mind that it's not a one-size-fits-all. There's a lot of different options, and I'm not going to be the one to get into the different options in a lot of detail, but there are a lot of different options. They have different advantages and disadvantages, and so we'll try to do a little bit of comparing and contrasting of some of those different options that are available. So when I work with producers that are thinking about confinement, there's several different reasons, but probably the biggest reason that we've seen kind of a push towards confinement, we see this in other parts of the country as well, is land cost and availability. The other reason is animal comfort. So we will talk about some animal comfort measures and talk about the impacts on environmental stressors on those animals and how we can impact that with moving to confinement systems. Controlling manure runoff, for comparing something to like an open lot. Animal health, again, opportunities and challenges there that we'll talk about. And then also managing feed resources. Is there a way that we can add value to something like a byproduct-based feed or another feed source that we're producing on our operation already by feeding it through to cattle in confinement? Now, some things that are maybe a little bit more farm specific is what type of animals are we thinking about putting in this system? Are we looking at a cow-calf system versus, say, a backgrounding system? Those two things are going to look very different in terms of how we evaluate the economics of these systems, or going all the way to finishing. These things are going to also impact the size of the barn that we are thinking about, or the number of animals that we might be able to put into that system. Total or partial or seasonal confinement. When I think about that, not being an economist, but when I think about it, I think about how do I get the most use out of the structure that I'm going to put on my operation and make the most use of it throughout the year. We're going to talk about labor. These systems can become labor intensive. And then also talk a little bit about bedding, because ultimately that labor and bedding are a pretty important component of making these types of systems work. So pulled some data looking at land costs in Kentucky relative to the average land costs across the U.S. in the last 22 or 23 years. Obviously, land values continue to increase. We are continuing to have competition with other agricultural commodities, new resources, things like solar going in, and how do we start to compete with that when we think about these beef cattle systems, when we start looking at some of the leases and things that are available versus moving to something like solar, and then of course just other expansion of our suburban areas that encroach into our rural areas. And so that land costs and land availability is oftentimes a big driver when we think about why we might want to look at moving to a confinement system. We can certainly house more animals on a smaller piece of land, and while that is a benefit, there are some other challenges that come with that. I talked about animal comfort. Animal comfort is highly correlated with animal performance, and so our cattle deal with things like environmental stressors, things like air temperature, wind, precipitation, relative humidity, solar stress, solar radiation, adding to that heat stress that our cattle in this part of the world might start to deal with. So certainly something like a confinement barn can help us weather some of that those environmental factors. Providing shade for our cattle, that is another potential benefit to those systems. Housing, again, providing shelter. That surface material can have an impact on things like animal comfort, whether we're talking about a dirt lot or concrete. And then obviously our bedding that we would put in on top of that concrete, all of those things start to play into this idea of animal comfort. And then also there's some animal factors there as well. Body condition, so our heavier conditioned cattle, more susceptible to things like heat stress. Hair coat, whether we're talking about the color or the length or density of that hair coat on that animal, can all have impacts on our animal performance and ultimately animal comfort when we start thinking about moving them into confinement. So one of the things that confinement allows us to do is have a little bit of control over Mother Nature. It's not going to eliminate all of our issues with Mother Nature, but we can provide things like shade from a confinement barn. We can also help keep those cattle dry and out of the wind. And when we start thinking about our cold conditions here in the state of Kentucky, at least, those are two things that ultimately can really cause some thermal stress on our cattle, is when we get those damp hair coats and get into windy situations. Obviously, mud is another thing that we can start to avoid with a confinement system. That is certainly a challenge for our cattle operations here in the state. One of the biggest things about confinement, when I think about that system versus having cattle out on pasture, is we start to be able to control variation. We can, control of that variation ultimately can allow us to have things like increased average daily gain, improved feed efficiency, and reduced illness. However, it's not as simple as we're going to build a barn, put them in there, and everything's going to go away. We're going to talk about some management challenges that come along with those things. But again, being able to take control of some of that variation from the environmental stressors certainly can help us when we start thinking about cattle performance. When I think about the types of cattle that could probably benefit the most from a confinement barn, certainly lightweight calves, those lightweight, heavy stressed kind of calves, they are more susceptible to illness. We know that when we bring them in, they can be a challenge from a health standpoint. So certainly getting them out of those muddy conditions, especially those muddy, wet, cool conditions that we sometimes have to deal with, that can be helpful. On the other kind of end of the spectrum, fat cattle, especially those that are black-hided, and when you think about the heat of the summer, having that access to shade from a confinement structure can certainly help those cattle perform better. And then I really think about some of our more intensive cow-calf systems. And what I mean by that is cattle that in operations where we're applying a lot of reproductive management, maybe some genetic improvement programs like embryo transfer programs and things like that, where we need to really manage those cattle a little more closely. Those are some situations that I think lend themselves a little more to confinement systems. Another thing that we have got to think about and have to get right, and again, I'm not going to get into the details of ventilation because I'm not an engineer, but we have one on the program today, so Dr. Hayes, I'm sure, will touch on this in more detail, but proper ventilation is really key to managing the temperature in that barn. It helps keep the bedding dry, and that bedding being dry really does help animal comfort. It also helps with things like managing pathogens and disease outbreak as well. So things like the style of barn that we're going to construct and the placement of that barn on our operation, those are things that ultimately are very critical to the success of that system. And we need to think about it pretty early in the planning stages, right? Those are things that are not easily changed once we've broken ground and construction begins. So those are things that we've got to get right from the get-go. So when we start thinking about size of these systems, we need to think about our goals. So we need to think about the number of cattle we're looking to house there, and then what type of barn that we're putting in. Something like a slatted floor requires less space than a bedded pack. These all require less space than, say, something like an open lot. You'll notice I don't have a value up here for slatted floor with cow-calf pairs. Ultimately, those little calves and those slats don't tend to work out very well together. Excuse me. And so that is why we typically don't make that recommendation for a cow-calf system. But again, as the size of the calves get bigger, we have to obviously provide more space for each individual animal. And so if we decide, for example, we're going to build a barn for backgrounding calves and then ultimately we want to move into a finishing system, keep in mind, if we set that for this number of calves here, we would have to have fewer calves in that finishing system in that same facility. Bunk space is another thing that we need to think about, linear feet of bunk space. So again, that varies whether we're talking about a cow-calf system or a backgrounding or a finishing system. Sorry. I put bulls in here because we do have situations where we have confinement cow-calf and they run a bull in there. We got to think about providing him bunk space as well in those barns. Other things to think about other than just linear length that we're providing to cattle at the feed bunk, it's whether or not we're going to put bunks on one or two sides of the barn. Obviously, that can impact the total length that we need for that barn. If we've got access to linear feet on both sides of the pen, then that pen may not have to be as long. Other things to think about is the bunk height and the depth of that bunk, whether we're going to have cows in that system or calves, that height will differ. Diet type is another thing to consider if we're feeding a high forage diet. Those are more bulky. They take up a greater volume than a higher concentrate diet. And so in that situation, we may need a little bit bigger bunk, a deeper bunk, or you may have to consider feeding twice a day versus a once a day system. Other considerations would be if we're feeding something like a liquid feed, how do we get that into the bunk and into the system? So when we think about total and partial confinement, thank you. All right, so thinking about total versus partial and maybe some ebbs and flows, and I kind of hinted to this already, that in a total system, when we try to maximize the number of days that we have cattle in the barn, that can certainly probably help us pencil that barn a little better. But also think about something like a cow-calf system. It's probably not practical that we have them in there 365 days of the year. When we think about a total system, we've always got our cattle in that barn, then we're providing 100% of our feed as a harvested feed. We do have the potential then to maximize performance advantages. Versus the partial system, we're going to have additional land or pasture resources for that other part of the year. That certainly may require less labor or maybe a seasonality to our labor availability. Same thing on the bedding material, less of it total, but also seasonality of bedding material. But then I put on here, what's the cost of an empty barn? Again, if we don't have cattle in it, then we're not getting the benefit out of it. Whether we're talking about total or partial, while those cattle are in the barn, we can benefit from targeted feeding programs, and we also get the environmental control compared to a non-confinement situation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about labor requirements right? So we build this structure, we put our cattle in, and now what, right? Now we've got to feed those cattle every day that they're in there. We've got to clean that barn. We've got to bed that barn. And that all takes man hours and labor. So whether we're feeding, mixing feed that's maybe a 1 to 2 hour process, again, every day, maybe twice a day, depending on your system. Again, adding bedding, cleaning the barn out. And certainly those hours spent will be different depending on the style barn that you have on your operation. So something like a slatted floor, we're not going to spend as many hours putting bedding in there, right? We don't have bedding in that system versus a bedded pack. When we start thinking about some of those compost bedded pack barns, and we have to go in there and we have to turn that bedding material over several times a week, that ultimately adds up to our labor costs. So this is some data out of South Dakota. They surveyed some South Dakota producers that had confinement barns. And what they found was that most people were cleaning them about once a week, but that varied from 4 times a week all the way up to every 2 weeks. So again, that's time spent that we wouldn't have in a non-confinement situation. Bedding average amount was about 4.25 pounds per head per day, but that ranged from 2 to 10 pounds per head per day. So quite a variation in the amount of bedding, and some of that may really be driven by bedding type. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So bedding material obviously can impact the absorptive value of that bedding. So things like pine chips, pine sawdust, shredded corn stover, oat straw have fairly mature hay has pretty good absorptive value. We compare that to other things that are on this list that maybe don't perform as well. By far, I think probably the most popular bedding choice here ends up being sawdust or straw. Other parts of the country use things like corn stalks to bed just based on the availability of what is local to you. But keep in mind that bedding material, we've got to have it available to us, and then that's going to kind of impact how much and how often we end up cleaning out those bunks. Other things to think about in these confinement barns, flooring considerations, they can really have an impact on things like lameness that we see in these cattle that are in confinement. If we kind of think back to some of the lameness issues that the swine industry has worked through and the dairy industry has worked through, obviously we start putting beef cattle into confinement on some of these concrete floors, we can have some of those similar issues arise. There are things that we can do like hatching the floor that can help with how slick that concrete surface is. We can add rubber mats on top of those concrete slats to make that more comfortable as well. So again, just things that we have to think about when we start thinking about how we put these barns together. Another thing that we don't talk a lot about in the beef industry, although I think we're really starting to have some more conversations about it compared to some of our other livestock species, is biosecurity and biocontainment. So 2 different words there, 2 different meanings. So biosecurity is the prevention of a disease outbreak. What do we do to make sure it doesn't happen? Biocontainment is what are we doing once we have that disease present on the operation. So of course, if we're thinking about especially bringing in calves, we spend a lot of time talking about respiratory disease. But things that we need to also kind of think about as we start to look at some of these confinement barns is things like digital dermatitis or hairy heel wart, foot rot, those issues there that, again, our friends over in the dairy industry have dealt with a lot and continue to deal with a lot. Those are things that we need to be thinking about when we think about moving into confinement. If we're calving in confinement, making sure that we're providing a clean environment for that calving. system to try to cut down on things like scours. All in, all out systems, of course, can help us limit some of that disease outbreak potential so that we're bringing in fewer pathogens over time. Cleaning these barns out really well after each turn of cattle, or if we've had a disease outbreak, that can help with the biocontainment side, quarantine protocols for new arrivals, and then that clean and dry bedding, again, really can have an impact on things like not only respiratory disease, but also those foot-related diseases as well. And the proper ventilation in that barn can set us up to help with that clean and dry bedding scenario. So some special considerations as we think about calving inside one of these confinement systems. Using the sandhills method. So that method, of course, started out in Nebraska, and we think about really big pastures. We can kind of apply that same concept to cow-calf systems in confinement. So we start with all the cattle in the same pen at the beginning of calving or the same area, and then we start moving those pregnant cows out and leaving the calves behind, or the pairs behind. And that can help us make sure that we've constantly got a clean environment for those calving systems. The snake system is it's doing kind of a similar thing there. The idea again is that new pair, that new cow-calf pair, is provided a clean environment, and we keep moving those pregnant animals away as they start calving. Another thing to think about, especially in these cow-calf systems, is providing a creep area. So that's a place where the calves can go and get away from the other cows in that system. It's a place where we can maybe provide a little additional bedding, a little extra comfort, might provide creep feeding, but also adds protection from things like wind and the other cattle in that system. So these are just a couple examples of some creep areas in some cow-calf confinement barns. One of the advantages I think about cattle in confinement is it can be easier to detect that illness earlier because we're up every day looking at those cattle. We're going out and feeding those cattle at least once a day. It's really easy to see who's coming to the bunk, who's not. If we take a few moments while we're doing that daily activity, we can actually potentially catch those cattle that are showing signs of illness a little more quickly. And a lot of our research shows if we catch them earlier, start applying treatment to those cattle, we can resolve the problem before it gets into a larger train wreck, if you will. So again, having those cattle up in confinement as opposed to maybe out on pasture allows us to have a little more interaction with them on a daily basis. We can catch those behavioral changes a little bit more quickly in those types of situations. Other advantages is if we have a working facility either in the confinement barn or close to it, it may be a little bit easier to get those calves up and get them treated if we need to. And again, we have opportunities maybe in these confinement systems to set up an area for quarantine or isolation if we are dealing with bringing in some of these high-risk calves. So when we think about some of the logistics of feeding cattle in these systems, one of the best opportunities we have is to apply a little bit better dietary management through something like a total mixed ration, as opposed to cattle out on pasture, right? When they're out on pasture, they're out grazing. I don't have as much control over what they're eating. But that does come with added labor. It comes with added expense with purchasing equipment if we don't already have that in our system. To be able to provide that TMR. It allows us an opportunity to limit feed. Again, we can do that even when they're not in confinement, but it's one way that we can limit feed some of these cows that are in confinement to where we're meeting their nutritional needs without feeding them as much as they actually want to consume. So they tend to not be very happy about that because they don't feel full. But they are, and we've formulated a ration to target a certain level of performance. And so that more consistent nutrition allows us to have increased milk production. It allows us to better manage a targeted body condition score. And ultimately, some of the cow-calf work was done at the University of Illinois shows that ultimately leads to increased weaning weight without having any negative impacts on reproductive performance. Other potential advantages, again, compared to having these cattle out in an extensive or pasture system, is that decreased energy expenditure that those cattle are having to extend due to just trying to move through the mud in those poor conditions. Potential advantage here when I think about the feeding program and some of these, if we really start thinking about an integrated crop and livestock system, is we have an opportunity to use some byproduct feeds or crop residues. Now we're using the cattle as a method to add value to those other feedstuffs available on our operation. Manure management. This can be a good thing, or it can be a negative thing. It's another thing we have to manage and make sure we take care of. But it allows us then to capture the value of that manure and spread it back on fields on our operation, or potentially sell it to a neighbor, something along those lines, to, again, try to capture the value of that manure from a nutrient standpoint. We got to think about how we're going to store that and handle it in something like a pit barn. You might, which one of the videos that we have later will show that type system, that they only are emptying that maybe once or twice a year, depending on the number of head that go through there. So it's a bigger job, but it's only once or twice a year versus something like a bedded pack. Depending on how you manage that pack, it may require more frequent cleanouts. So just the amount of manure that's produced can vary greatly based on the size of the animal, the type of diet that they're consuming. The moisture content of that manure can also differ based on diet type, but kind of just a general ballpark from a 750 to 1,000 pound animal, you're looking anywhere from 35 to 55 pounds of manure production a day that, again, we have to be doing something with. But of course that, again, is going to vary pretty greatly. So to kind of put that all together, and again, I hope this is just giving you some things to think about for your particular operation. Advantages, we can apply consistent management. More so, we can have a little bit more control than what we have in an extensive system. We can get more animals on a smaller piece of land. We can see increased calf performance. We have decreased environmental stressors on those animals. We have manure resources that we can take advantage of, and improved animal comfort. Now, keep in mind, that's assuming that everything went right? And that we didn't run into a train wreck where we had a big disease outbreak or something like that could certainly wipe out any potential increase in performance. Disadvantages, obviously, the glaring one there is just the cost to put a system in and operate that system. I put on here potential for train wrecks. I feel like anytime we start getting more cattle confined in a smaller area, it's kind of like kids at daycare. Dr. Hayes and I were talking about that earlier. They like to spread their germs around. We see the same thing when we start getting more cattle in a smaller area. What is that cost to gain, right? I talked about potential performance advantages by having cattle in confinement compared to the calves out on pasture. But what is the added cost of that gain? That's going to vary from operation to operation, but the question is was that cost to gain effective or not? Because certainly a 1/10 to 2/10 of a pound increase in average daily gain, depending on what that costs you, may not be as advantageous as it sounds at first glance. Again, manure management is something else, it's another thing that we've got to take care of when we start thinking about these confinement systems. So again, that can be an advantage or a disadvantage. Labor, I cannot stress that one enough. You've got to manage these every day. And so certainly that's something we've got to think about. Labor is one of the biggest challenges that we see in the beef industry. Anytime we do surveys, that always comes back as one of the biggest challenges or limitations that we have. So that certainly cannot be ignored when we think about moving to this type of system. And then again, bedding, having to deal with that bedding, source that bedding, and have that available can become a challenge. So to kind of take all that and put it together, remember it's not one size fits all. It's going to depend on your production system, the type of barn that you're looking at. These will not solve poor management. It'll only make it worse. Because again, anytime we kind of start to make it more intensive, if we aren't doing a good job there, I think our potential for problems comes up. That's not to say that these systems can't work well, because we see them work well all the time, but we also see train wrecks as well. Proper and consistent management is required to get that benefit. Again, the labor requirements, we've got to consider that. One thing that I think we tend to not do very well is price what our time is worth. Because keep in mind, once you kind of put this system in place, you are kind of getting married to that system. So it needs to be something that we think about pretty heavy before we start construction on anything like that on our operation. And often it's a total system change. How we source our feed, how we deliver our feed, what our day-to-day looks like on the operation is potentially changing when we think about these confinement situations. So careful thought and planning will go a long way to helping make this system work from a logistical standpoint. So with that, that's all I've got for you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.